Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and click on that like button if you like my video. Also click on that notification bell. Thank you. This lecture is about changing SSH port on your Linux machine. Now let's first take a quick review how a server connects from one server to another. Well, of course you know that it connects from IP to IP. If your server has an IP and the remote server that you're trying to connect has an IP. But it doesn't end right here. Every server that runs services to listen has a predefined ports. So to connect from any Unix-like operating system to another Unix-like operating system, you have to connect through SSH. And the SSH port runs on port 22. And that is by default, that is out of the box, that's the port you get. And if you're running Telnet, you will see it is running on port 23. Anyway, Telnet should not be using at all because it's not secure at all. If you're using Telnet, you should stop it right away. So anyway, SSH port number 2 is the one that is used to connect to a Linux machine. And you could get a listing of all the ports in Etsy services. So by default, all the applications or programs or services that run in your Linux machine has a predefined ports attached to them. You could change them, but by default they come in as a predefined. And who comes up with those ports? Well, there is IEEE. Probably you heard of that organization. They are the one who define which port connects to which service and so on. But anyway, we don't want to get into that. We just wanted to make sure how we could change that default port 22 to a different port. Let me get into a more figurative way so you will understand exactly what this whole lecture is about. So there is a server A, and that server wants to connect to server B. Now server A would use some kind of a middle party terminal like PuTTY, or if it's a Windows machine and it's trying to connect to another Windows machine, it will use something like remote desktop connection. Now it has the built-in algorithm like PuTTY has that runs on port 22. If you open up a PuTTY, you will see where you put in the IP address, right next to it, it has a port number predefined for you, which is 22. You could change that if you have changed it to the remote server. Anyway, so that you connect using the IP and the port number, and then you send the request to the remote server, server B. Now server B says, hey, I got the request and you are asking me, or you are trying to connect to me using port 22. Let me first see if I have a listening, a SSHD service running that is listening on port 22. And it says, yes, I do have SSHD running and it is running on port 22. Perfect. And go ahead and create it and establish a session. Perfect. Session is established. Everything works. Everything's hunky-dory. Perfect. Now, what happened when a hacker comes into the equation? A hacker wants to get into server B. Now, of course, he wants to get into every which way. So he usually, what hackers do, they have a pre-written script or executable that they have which actually attacks all the ports, and whichever ports are open, they are in luck and they will attack that port. So that attack goes out and the attack says, hey, I am trying to get to these port 22, 53 and so on, whichever the service those ports belong to. So now if you had changed that port from 22 to, let's say, SSHD change port to 110, then you would have prevented that attack completely. See, that's how you could change the port and make your Linux server more secure. Let's look at how we could make that change in a Linux machine. First of all, we'll make a backup of our configuration file. And the configuration file is etc sshd_config. That's where we go in and change the port number. Then we modify that file and we change the parameter that says port 22, change it to port 1110. By the way, 1110 is just an arbitrary number or any number that I picked. But make sure you are not picking the port that is being used by other services because it's going to cause a conflict. To find out which port is available, you could go to etc services file, and whichever port that you'd want to um, assign to port SSH, then you could grep for that port and make sure it is not in use. Anyway, I have checked that already. The 1110 is not assigned or not associated with any services, so I'm going to use that port just for this practice or this exercise or for this lecture. Now, once that is done, I will save the file and I will restart the server or restart the service and restart the services systemctl restart sshd. By the way, I had a single quote at the beginning, which somehow got deleted. But anyway, you don't need double quotes. So at the end of SSHD, you see double quote. You could just ignore that. Then from Unix like OS connect using command syntax like SSH username at IP-P for port and define the port number. Now I'll go into my Linux machine and we could try that on our Linux machine and see how it works. So right now, first, if you see, I'm gonna open up a new session and you see right here, if I put in my IP address 192.168.1. Let's see, what is my IP address? My IP address 192.168.1.36. So I will put 36, and you see by default it's giving me port 22. And when I click open, it should allow me to connect. See, I'm connected. Perfect. So now I wanted to change that port 22. So let me close that, and I will go first make a backup copy. First clear the screen, copy etc ssh sshd underscore config, and I will make a copy and I'll put it somewhere like in temp ssh underscore config, and I'll make it orig. It is copied. Perfect. If I make a mistake, I could always revert back to this file. Also, you could make a snapshot of your Linux machine as well in case you cannot get in and you want to revert back. So now I have made a copy. Perfect. Now I will modify the sshd underscore config file. So I'll go to etc ssh and vi sshd underscore config, and I'll go to the line where it says port 22. I'm not going to modify that because it's already commented out. What I'll do is I'll add another line by hitting O, and I'll put port. P, make sure is uppercase, and I'll put it port 1110. That's it. Save it, and it will take effect when you restart the service. Systemctl restart sshd. That's it. It restarted. Now when I try to connect, new session, load, and when I try to connect to this machine using port 22, let's see what happens. Open. See, network error, connection refused. Why? Because the SSHD is no longer listening on port 22. So that's how you could avoid the attack. Now, if you wanted to do the same thing and you do new session and you do load the service and change the port 1110 and do open, and there you go. Now I am able to connect and it is working as expected. So that's how you could avoid the attack and how you can make your system secure.